What would author, activist, Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel have thought of being carved into a church? This is how Elie Wiesel's son, Elisha, begins an editorial, an opinion piece that was published in the Washington Post this past week. The occasion being that our Washington National Cathedral unveiled and dedicated a carving of the great Holocaust survivor, Elie Wiesel, in the human rights porch. So Wiesel now joins Oscar Romero, Eleanor Roosevelt, Jonathan Daniels, Rosa Parks, Mother Teresa, as permanently depicted, his head on what they call a label mold termination stone. I only know that because I used to work there. It's kind of like if you follow the arc and it comes down to a point. Of course, at the cathedral, it's all limestone. So his head is now there on one of the corners, right at the entrance when you come into the cathedral. The son asks in the opinion piece what to make of the fact that a well-known Jew, a survivor of the Holocaust, is now depicted in a church. He expresses, ultimately, some hesitant appreciation for the honor. But for me, the editorial highlights directly with today's passage from the prophet Isaiah, which over the centuries has been used again and again by Christians as a weapon against our Jewish siblings. The passage's history from today, Isaiah's chapter 53, has this history of interpretation that relates directly to the painful history of Christian persecution of Jews and the appropriation of Jewish tradition by the church. This passage in particular is one of 4 so-called servant poems in the prophet Isaiah. And it's been used as early as the 2nd century as proof against the Jews not recognizing their own Messiah. Because Christians, myself included, it's hard to read today's text from the prophet Isaiah and not see Jesus all over it. There's no getting around the fact that Christian tradition interprets Isaiah's suffering servant as Jesus. In fact, scholars of the Gospels argue that Jesus himself, Jesus of Nazareth, who was a Jew, modeled his ministry after the suffering servant in Isaiah. Jesus would have known Isaiah, would have known the model servant. I also cannot get out of my head, for any other classical music fans, Handel's Messiah, which depicts several of today's verses in choral fashion. It makes sense to understand Jesus as the suffering servant, but I'd like this morning to try and put ourselves more in the shoes of a 6th century BCE listener of the prophet's original poem. The context would be vital here, and I know we're not all Old Testament buffs. This passage in Isaiah is a long book. If you didn't know, it's very long. And scholars say that it kind of is divided up into 3 historic sections, which spans about 300 years. And so the section that today's passage comes from, the middle, 2nd Isaiah, which scholars date to the 6th century BCE. This is when, so if you know your ancient Israel history, right, there was Genesis, the Exodus, looking for the promised land. They found the promised land. Then they fought amongst themselves for a long, long time. They appointed a king. And then the Babylonians came and destroyed Jerusalem. And they were exiled to go live in Babylon for an entire generation. And it's during the exile, when ancient Israel experienced its lowest moment, that so much of the Bible as we have it today was in fact written. Ancient Israel trying to make sense of this most devastating moment in their history. Their temple had been destroyed and they had been exiled. And so today's text comes right in the midst of this middle section in which the Babylonians are being overtaken by the Persians. And the Persians take a different approach to political, religious plurality, which is to accommodate the Jews and to say, you may go home now. And so ancient Israel is wrestling, the prophet is wrestling with the fact that after a generation of having been exiled, we're now allowed to go back to our promised land. The exiled people are invited to imagine themselves yet again as God's favored people, to imagine themselves yet again as God's servants. The poem in the Old Testament passage today begins with an attempt to find meaning of suffering, meaning in the suffering. The original English translation is, surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. Then the key point, though, comes in the second and third and fourth verses, our complicity. The listeners understand that they are complicit in the servant's suffering somehow, that they somehow caused it. He was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole. By his bruises, we are healed. Key question now being, who is he? Who is the servant? Lots and lots of ink has been spilled over answering that very question, particularly for us. If for a Jewish audience, the answer is not Jesus, who is the suffering servant? Playing with the pronouns helps, I think, to answer this question. In your bulletins, actually, before we printed them, I changed all the pronouns to you, in keeping with St. Margaret's tradition of inclusive language, and also to help us not immediately see it as Jesus. You. I would propose, if I were to go back and have prepared my sermon before the bulletins were printed, I would propose we put third person plural, they. They have borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. We accounted them stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. They were wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon them was the punishment that made us whole. I want to argue that the original intent here was to honor the exiles. Because a little interesting fact that I learned in seminary that is hard to discern from the Bible on the surface is that in ancient Israel's history, although the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem and a majority were exiled to Babylon, there were some who stayed. They weren't the powerful elite, but they stayed in the homeland. And so imagine those who had stayed regarding the suffering of those who had left. Ancient Jewish tradition sees this passage in 2nd Isaiah as a kind of second Exodus, this ability to return home. But also, now, how do we make sense of the suffering that has been endured for a generation? How do we make sense of the fact that my fellow Israelites suffered and I did not? This is the question that the poet is trying to answer. The question of vicarious suffering, meaning those who suffer on another's behalf. The question of why innocent people suffer at all. Well, some don't. That question is as urgent today as it was in the 6th century BCE. I tried to pray about who would they be today? And I couldn't help but immediately think of our experience of these past, I've lost track of the count. I used to say 18 months, but how long has the pandemic been going on now? Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, I think of the injustice between those of us who've been infected, those of us who haven't. Those of us who've been able to work from home and those of us who can't. Frontline workers, they have borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. They have been wounded for our transgressions. 45 million cases in the United States. 724,000 people dead in the United States, for our comfort with the economic status quo, for our failure to create a society in which it's actually possible to attain self-flourishing. By their bruises, we are healed. There's one more problem we need to try and unravel a little bit in this text today, which comes near the end of the poem, the idea that God caused all of this, that God caused the suffering, and that somehow the suffering is redemptive. It was the will of Yahweh to crush them with pain, verse 10 reads. The problem of unjust suffering is addressed by Scripture in lots of conflicting ways throughout the entire Bible. The book of Job, most helpful to me, because after searching out the answer, the end of the book dramatically ends with saying, you don't get to know. You do not get to know the answer to this most urgent faith question. On this side of the veil, for whatever reason, God does not explain to us, reveal to us why suffering exists. It's inadequate. It also is a counter to so many people who try and tell us what suffering is all about. I and most progressive faith leaders, I hope you will encounter, will not tell you that God causes all suffering. And yet, I find that for those of us who have our stuff, we all do, it is possible for us as individuals to make sense of what we have experienced. We're always searching for meaning to try and understand, why is this happening? Why is this happening? It's not been particularly helpful for me ever to imagine that God caused it. But somehow on the other end, when I've been through the worst of it and I look back and I feel that I'm somehow a better person, I've made sense. The key thing is, I'm not going to tell you what your suffering means. And I'd appreciate it if you not try and tell me what mine means. But let's listen to one another and work it out for ourselves. The grace in this passage is not that God caused the suffering. That's not what this passage is about. The servant here willingly and compassionately plays their role. The servant was oppressed and afflicted. They did not open their mouths, like lambs that are led to a slaughter, like sheep that before their shearers are silent. They did not open their mouths. Willfully playing the role of a symbolic sacrificial lamb is not the same thing as God causing suffering. It's not the same thing as innocent suffering caused by our sinfulness as humanity. It's the compassionate service of the servant, I think, that most leads those of us who are Christian to see Jesus here. Perhaps for Isaiah's original audience, the point was to see the servant as model people to emulate. Where's the good news? There's a moralistic call here for sure, to be like the suffering servant, to sacrifice ourselves for the sake of others. That's clear from the text. But if you know me at all, and you've heard me preach before, you know that I like to try and identify, what is God doing here? Because when it's all on us, it's so exhausting. What is God doing through this text? To answer, I think we have to go wider through the entirety of Isaiah and remember the original context of what's going on here historically. From an Isaian standpoint, the good news is that God is making a way for the people to experience new life. God is making a way for them to attain that which they had lost. God is making a way for them to go home, to rest in their identity as servants of God. This is the good news that I read here this morning.